So as a result of this, within the Democratic Party of 1944, there was almost a conspiracy as such, where the delegates within that convention decided, actually, we don't want to elect this man. FDR, we recognise he's very sick and he's very old and he could die at any moment, and we don't want this guy to be one heartbeat away from the president, so we're going to pick a safer bet. And the safer bet that they picked, he was a rather insignificant man from Missouri, and this was Harry Truman. So he'd been a senator. If you look at his life story, it was very, very uneventful up until the point at which he became the vice president. All of a sudden, when he became the vice president, within a few months, FDR died and he ended up taking over as the president. So the effect that Harry Truman had, especially within that first term as president, is so huge, it literally does take books to cover it. What you have to recognise is that, first of all, one of the major acts that he ended up doing when he became president is the dropping of the atomic bomb. So he oversaw the defeat of Germany, oversaw the defeat of Japan, and he set the world up for the Cold War, because the Soviets were obviously expanding. After they already conquered Nazi Germany and liberated Eastern Europe, they then put Eastern Europe in their back pocket, and the threat of communism spreading throughout the rest of the world. This is something which Harry Truman was one of the first people to actually notice, all the way back at the Potsdam conference. If you compare how FDR handled Stalin and Molotov, like his foreign minister, to how Truman handled it, from the very beginning, because of Truman's anti-communist stance here, he was very, very suspicious of the Soviets. When, for instance, Churchill in 1946 spoke in front of the president and said, "There's an iron curtain that has descended across the continent of Europe." This really helped to prompt where Harry Truman was already planning on taking things. He already wanted to contain communism and to stop it spreading into other countries. And this is what led to the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine sets the stage for what happens in the rest of the Cold War. America's foreign policy for the rest of the Cold War is that any country that is at risk of going communist is going to be aided, it's going to be armed, and if need be, troops are going to be sent in to stop it from going communist. And this was something which Harry Truman was at the absolute apex of pushing. Okay, so you might ask, surely Truman couldn't have been that different, compared to Wallace. Surely any US president in the post-war world would have done something against the obvious expansion of communism around the world. No, no. So if we look at Henry Wallace, how do we put it nicely? He was, at best, incredibly naive. Here's some examples. Upon visiting the Soviet Union and visiting the Gulag system, he was told by Soviet officials there that the prisoners were volunteers. Now, anyone with any kind of common sense would recognize that actually people working almost to death, well, in many cases working to death, in the middle of freezing Siberian winter, they're not volunteering. Why would you volunteer for that? But his response was classic. He said that the volunteers in these gulags, the volunteers, he said that the Gulag system was a mixture between the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is basically a big New Deal policy to give hydroelectric power to many places in the South. He said that it was a mixture between the TVA and the Hudson Bay Company. You'd have to be incredibly naive to not recognize this. This is the equivalent of the actual kind of Nazi death camps, okay? This was serious stuff, yeah. Like 20 million people died in the Soviet Union. Not all of them in the gulags, but many, many people were sent there by Stalin, and these people were either executed or froze to death or starved to death or worked to death, etc., or tortured, everything. It was terrible. So he completely went, ooh, didn't understand what all that was about. He also was very, very naive in the sense of all the countries in Eastern Europe after the war were overthrown one by one by the communists, yeah. But the last one, and one of the most obvious, egregious ones, where it was just clear cut, this is clearly a communist coup, was Czechoslovakia in 1948. His response was oh, well, what's the big deal? And actually, this was in line with what he had said in a very famous speech 2 years before. Truman took him on into the cabinet, and he ended up making an impromptu speech in front of a group of people who, many of them were Marxists themselves, they were communists, right? He got booed for this speech, but there's nowhere compared to how much he was about to get booed for. So within this speech, he said that the USA had no more business in what the Soviets did in Eastern Europe, then the Soviets would have interest in what America did in Latin America. Now, this was booed by the communist audience there because it implied that the Soviets shouldn't have any kind of say in what happened in Latin America. So obviously they were pro-Stalinist and they wanted like kind of, yeah, they wanted the whole world to kind of be taken over by communism. How the rest of the country responded to that speech was, hold on, what? This guy who's in our government, yeah, says that it's fine basically for the Soviets to have a free hand in Eastern Europe and to take over the countries there and to have them under occupation essentially, and and no free elections, like complete like Stalinist dictatorships installed in all these countries. Yeah, that's completely fine. We've got no business on there. You can understand from a foreign policy perspective just how naive he was. Never mind the fact that in the 1940s you had the Greek Civil War, which was actually one of the main catalysts for the Truman Doctrine, because Harry Truman, like in the middle of this Greek Civil War, where the communists were fighting the royalists, Britain ended up pulling out because they couldn't afford to keep keeping the troops there. So Harry Truman said, actually, we're going to send arms, we're going to send money to prop up like the anti-communists there, and we're going to fight against communists. That's part of what spurred on the Truman Doctrine. If we see how Henry Wallace reacted in all of these other crises, we can see very clearly that actually he wouldn't have stepped in, because 1946 was when the Truman Doctrine was first laid out, and 1946 is when he made this speech basically saying it's none of our business what happens in Eastern Europe. And never mind as well, what else is little known, which is that France and Italy, because they had very, very large communist parties after the war, in both those countries, there was a high probability that they could, in an election, go communist. If Italy and France went communist, then that puts the rest of Western Europe in peril then, because West Germany would then be completely surrounded by communist powers, and also the Benelux countries as well would be threatened. Because it was such a big thing, the CIA under Truman put lots of money into campaigns for different anti-communist parties in both France and Italy, and as a result of some of this additional funding, these anti-communist parties were able to narrowly win in those elections, and to keep the communists out of power. If there hadn't been this impetus, by Truman to oppose communism, there's every chance that France and Italy could have fallen to communism. And then if that happened, then the rest of Europe would probably have fallen sooner or later. So this would have been not very well received, to put it very lightly. In our own timeline, we had something called Mccarthyism, which was directed against many people in America who were seen as either communist or fellow travellers of communists, i.e. communist sympathisers. Henry Wallace was deemed as to be one of these sympathisers, because he clearly was quite happy to have lots of policies which were quite in keeping with the communists, and he himself didn't recognise what the Soviets were doing and what actual threat of communism there was. In a real world scenario, Harry Truman narrowly won the 1948 election. It was so close, the press the day before called the election and said that Dewey, the Republican candidate, was going to win the election. So they tried to preempt it by printing out the stories and be like, Dewey's won, and so there's Truman there celebrating, being like, haha, obviously I won. That was very narrow in this time. Never mind if France and Italy and Greece had fallen to communism, he wouldn't have been re-elected. In America, you would have had McCarthyism on steroids. It was really pretty hyped up during the late 40s and early 50s, with people being very wary of so-called Reds under the bed, of communists in the State Department, of communists in Hollywood, communists in music and art and everywhere. This would have been ramped up even more if the whole of Western Europe basically went communist. So what about his domestic agenda? Well, a lot of people said that the policy goals of Henry Wallace were very good, they would have been very progressive, and he said that America would have had a lot more social justice if this had been done. However, what we have to understand is that this conservative coalition, which we spoke of before, dominated Congress from 1937 up until 1963. And as I said earlier, they were able to stop Harry Truman's Fair Deal, which is a very, very watered down version of all of this. So not only would you have had embarrassment on an international level, people already talking about how the Democrats have dropped the ball in 1949 with the loss of China, China going communist. If all of Western Europe had also gone communist, this would have been absolutely massive. And so as a result of that, people would have hated Henry Wallace for his foreign policy, and on a domestic policy, whether you agreed with the policies or not, there is no way this conservative coalition who dominated Congress would have allowed any of his agenda to have gone through. So he would have been a terrible president in terms of foreign policy. If your countries like opponents end up having a stronger hand and you end up having a weaker hand, then that means that you've done a bad job in terms of foreign policy. The point of foreign policy is to keep your enemies at bay and for you to be able to at least maintain, if not expand, one's own influence. And especially in terms of like liberal democratic values, these values would have ended up retreating in many places in Western Europe. So there would have been the twin thing of his foreign policy being seen as the disaster and his domestic policy being, he would have been seen as a complete lame duck president. So as a result, if Henry Wallace had become the president instead of Harry Truman, I think we can imagine a very, very different America. It took a lot for JFK even in 1960 to be elected, and that was because he ran hard as a very fervent Cold War warrior and a very fervent I'm a liberal but also I'm very tough on this. I'm pro defense. I'm pro states' rights. I'm pro this. I'm pro balanced budgets. All this kind of stuff, right? So he sounded very much like a conservative, even though he was a liberal on many things. And that was the only way that he was able to be elected in 1960. The damage would have been so huge. I don't see a Democratic president anytime before at least the late 60s, if not the 1970s. And then add to this, Henry Wallace was widely criticised by the fact that he knew obviously about the Manhattan Project, which was the project for America to get nuclear weapons. He offered to give these nuclear weapons up to an international body. He wanted to spread it around so that the whole world would have access to how to make nuclear weapons. When in the Manhattan Project, in our own timeline, we had Soviet spies spying in on it, and that's how they were able to, in 1949, get the bomb. If it had just been given to the rest of the world, the Soviets would have had it as early as probably 1946, if not earlier. So again, this would have been another thing which would have gone against America's interest. Henry Wallace would have been seen as the person who lost Western Europe to communism. He would have been seen as a lame duck president who wouldn't have got any of his policies enacted, and he would have been seen as the person who gave away the nuclear secret to the Soviets.